There are moments in the life of a country when the words themselves are only part of the story. The setting, the timing, the audience, and the history surrounding those words often reveal far more than the speech ever could. That's what made President Donald Trump's appearance at Mount Rushmore on July 3, 2020, so unusual. It wasn't simply another campaign-style address or a 4th of July celebration. It was a carefully chosen moment, delivered from one of the most recognizable symbols of American identity, just one day before Independence Day and only months before a presidential election. Whether people admired the speech or strongly disagreed with it, almost everyone understood that the location mattered. Think about that for a second. Presidents speak from many places. The Oval Office carries one kind of authority. The steps of the Capitol carry another. Military bases project strength. Disaster sites communicate empathy. But Mount Rushmore belongs to a different category altogether. It isn't just a monument. It is a story carved into stone. The faces of 4 presidents, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Theodore Roosevelt, and Abraham Lincoln, represent 4 different chapters of the American experiment. Standing beneath those granite faces naturally invites comparisons with history, leadership, and national identity. Any speech delivered there becomes part of a larger conversation before a single sentence is spoken. Now that's important because political speeches are rarely just about information. They are about symbolism. Every backdrop sends a message. Every camera angle tells viewers how to interpret the moment. Long before President Trump began speaking, the image itself had already communicated something. Millions watching on television saw an American president standing beneath 4 of the nation's most influential historical figures. Whether intentional or not, the visual suggested continuity between the present and the past. That symbolism became almost as widely discussed as the speech itself. But here's what makes this different. The country that gathered around television screens that evening was deeply divided. The summer of 2020 was unlike almost any period in recent American history. The COVID-19 pandemic had disrupted everyday life across the country. Businesses had closed. Schools had changed dramatically. Families were dealing with uncertainty about health, work, and the future. At the same time, nationwide protests had followed the killing of George Floyd, leading to an intense public debate about policing, racial justice, public memory, and the meaning of American history itself. That debate quickly expanded beyond policy. It became a debate over symbols. Across the United States, statues of historical figures were being removed, relocated, or reconsidered by local governments and institutions. Some removals were official decisions. Others resulted from demonstrations or acts of vandalism. Supporters argued that many monuments celebrated individuals connected to slavery, colonialism, or injustice. Opponents argued that removing monuments risked erasing history rather than confronting it. The arguments were emotional because they were never only about bronze or stone. They were about identity, memory, and the stories a nation chooses to tell about itself. And that's where Mount Rushmore entered the national conversation in a much larger way. Although the monument had long been viewed by many Americans as a patriotic landmark, it also carried a complicated history. It stands in the Black Hills of South Dakota, an area that is sacred to the Lakota Sioux. The land itself remains the subject of a long-standing legal and historical dispute. In 1980, the United States Supreme Court ruled that the Black Hills had been taken illegally from the Sioux Nation under the Fort Laramie Treaty. Financial compensation was awarded, but many Sioux leaders declined the money, maintaining that the land itself, not compensation, was what mattered. Let's stay with that idea for a moment. This doesn't automatically redefine what Mount Rushmore means to every American. Symbols often carry multiple meanings at once. For millions of visitors each year, the monument represents national achievement, democracy, and presidential leadership. For others, it also represents broken treaties and unresolved questions about indigenous history. Both perspectives exist simultaneously. That complexity is precisely why the location of Trump's speech attracted so much attention. The monument was already part of an ongoing national conversation before the president ever arrived. What happened next matters because President Trump chose not to avoid those debates. Instead, he addressed them directly. During his speech, he argued that the United States was facing what he described as an effort to erase its history and undermine its founding values. He criticized attacks on monuments and emphasized the importance of protecting America's historical legacy. Those were confirmed public statements delivered before a live audience and broadcast nationally. Supporters viewed the speech as a defense of national heritage during a period of unrest. Critics argued that it framed complex historical debates too narrowly and overlooked legitimate concerns about injustice and historical accountability. Notice something interesting here. The disagreement wasn't only about what Trump said. It was also about what different audiences believed the speech represented. Political communication often works on multiple levels. One listener hears a call for unity around shared national symbols. Another hears an appeal aimed at a specific political base. Someone else hears a response to ongoing cultural conflict rather than an attempt to resolve it. The exact same words can produce entirely different interpretations depending on the experiences and assumptions of the audience. That's not unique to this speech. Throughout American history, presidents have used symbolic locations to reinforce broader political messages. Ronald Reagan spoke at the Normandy beaches to reflect on sacrifice and freedom. Barack Obama chose Selma to discuss the civil rights movement and democratic participation. George W. Bush addressed the nation from the ruins of the World Trade Center after the September 11th attacks, allowing the location itself to reinforce the emotional weight of his message. In each case, the setting became part of the argument. The location wasn't decoration, it was evidence. Now consider Trump's decision through that same lens. Mount Rushmore was not a neutral stage. It was a place already associated with debates about history, patriotism, memory, and identity. Choosing that backdrop inevitably shaped how people interpreted every sentence that followed. Even viewers who never watched the full speech often remembered the image itself. Sometimes political communication works exactly that way. The picture survives longer than the paragraphs, but the real question isn't whether people agreed with the speech or rejected it. The more revealing question is why that particular message was delivered at that particular place during that particular moment in American history. Because once you begin examining those choices together, the speech starts to look less like an isolated event and more like one piece of a much larger political story, one that extends far beyond a single summer evening beneath four faces carved into stone. And that's where the deeper analysis begins. What most people missed was that the speech was unfolding on two completely different levels at the same time. On one level, it was a public address delivered by a sitting president during an Independence Day celebration. On another, it was a carefully framed statement about how Americans should understand their own history. Those are not the same thing. One concerns current events. The other concerns national identity. And in politics, identity often lasts much longer than any individual policy debate. You know, governments change, presidents come and go, laws are amended, economic conditions improve or decline. But the stories a nation tells about itself tend to endure. That's why political leaders across history have invested enormous effort in shaping historical narratives. Whoever influences the way people remember the past often gains influence over how they imagine the future. Think about that for a second. History is rarely just about facts. The facts themselves may be documented, but the meaning attached to those facts is constantly debated. Which events deserve celebration? Which deserve criticism? Which figures become heroes? Which become warnings? These questions exist in every democracy because history is never completely settled. Each generation revisits it through the lens of its own challenges. By the summer of 2020, that process was happening at an unusually intense pace in the United States. Following nationwide protests after the killing of George Floyd, conversations about racial justice expanded into broader discussions about public memory. Local governments reconsidered monuments, universities renamed buildings, museums updated exhibits, sports teams and corporations reassessed long-standing symbols and branding. None of these developments came from a single institution or political movement. They emerged from thousands of individual decisions taking place across the country. To supporters of these changes, they represented an effort to confront historical injustices more honestly. They argued that societies should not publicly honor individuals whose legacies included slavery, discrimination, or oppression without acknowledging those realities. But opponents viewed the same developments very differently. They argued that removing monuments and changing historical symbols risked simplifying history instead of understanding it. In their view, imperfect historical figures should be studied rather than erased, because nearly every major leader reflected the flaws of their own era. Notice something important here. These two perspectives were not necessarily arguing over the same question. One side focused on who deserves public honor. The other focused on how societies preserve historical continuity. Those are related debates, but they are not identical, and that's why the political atmosphere became so emotionally charged. People often believed they were discussing statues. In reality, they were discussing identity. President Trump's Mount Rushmore speech entered directly into that debate. He argued that America was facing what he described as a campaign to tear down its history and cultural heritage. Those remarks reflected his publicly stated position at the time. He connected attacks on monuments with what he portrayed as a broader rejection of American values and traditions. Supporters saw this as an overdue defense of national pride. Critics argued that the speech treated legitimate historical criticism as hostility toward America itself. Whether one agrees with either interpretation is ultimately a matter of political judgment. But here's where the story becomes even more interesting. If you step back from the immediate political arguments, the speech also reflected something much older, an enduring tension in American history between unity and self-criticism. The United States has always balanced two powerful ideas. One is the belief that America represents an exceptional political experiment founded on liberty, constitutional government, and individual rights. The other is the recognition that those ideals have not always been applied equally throughout the country's history. These two ideas have existed side by side since the nation's founding. They are visible in debates over slavery. They appear in discussions about Reconstruction. They emerge during the Civil Rights Movement. They continue through conversations about immigration, voting rights, and equality. Every generation inherits both narratives. One emphasizes aspiration. The other emphasizes accountability. Neither completely replaces the other. Now consider how Mount Rushmore itself reflects this tension. The monument features 4 presidents who undeniably shaped the United States. George Washington led the Revolutionary War and became the nation's first president. Thomas Jefferson authored much of the Declaration of Independence while also enslaving hundreds of people during his lifetime. Abraham Lincoln preserved the Union and issued the Emancipation Proclamation during the Civil War. Theodore Roosevelt expanded America's global influence while also representing an era whose policies toward Native Americans remain subjects of historical debate. Each figure represents extraordinary achievement. Each also represents historical complexity. That's important because political speeches delivered at symbolic places inevitably inherit those complexities. A president standing beneath those faces cannot simply invoke greatness without also inviting questions about the fuller historical record. Whether those questions become central depends on the audience. Some viewers primarily saw 4 iconic presidents. Others immediately thought about indigenous land claims. Still others focused on the timing of the speech amid nationwide protests. The monument itself had not changed. The perspective surrounding it had, and that's one of the defining characteristics of political symbolism. Its meaning evolves with society. Now let's look at another detail that received far less attention than the speech itself: the timing. The address took place on July 3rd, the evening before Independence Day. That decision naturally connected Trump's remarks with one of America's most significant civic holidays. The 4th of July has traditionally emphasized national unity, shared ideals, and collective celebration. Presidents from both major political parties have often used Independence Day to reflect on America's founding principles rather than day-to-day political disputes. Trump's speech followed that tradition in some respects by emphasizing patriotism and the nation's founding ideals, but it also departed from that tradition by directly engaging with ongoing cultural conflicts. That distinction matters. Instead of treating Independence Day as a pause from political disagreement, the speech presented those disagreements themselves as central to the country's future. For supporters, this reflected necessary honesty. For critics, it intensified polarization during an already tense period. Again, both reactions were widely documented in media coverage and public commentary. Neither can be dismissed simply because the other exists. But here's another overlooked layer. Political speeches are often remembered less for what they say than for what they signal. Campaign strategists sometimes refer to this as narrative framing. Rather than persuading every listener on every issue, successful political communication often seeks to define the central question people should be asking. In this case, Trump's speech encouraged audiences to think less about individual monuments and more about whether America's historical identity itself was under challenge. That shift from specific events to broader narratives may have been one of the speech's most politically significant features, because once politics becomes a debate over identity rather than policy, compromise becomes much more difficult. Economic issues can often be negotiated, budgets can be rewritten, laws can be amended. Identity is different. People rarely negotiate what they believe defines their nation. And that's why this speech continues to attract attention years later. The lasting discussion isn't simply about Mount Rushmore. It isn't even only about Donald Trump. It's about the larger question that has surfaced repeatedly throughout American history. Who gets to define the meaning of America? Because once that question moves to the center of political life, every speech, every monument, and every national symbol begins to carry far more weight than it did before. And that brings us to the question that has lingered long after the applause faded and the television cameras were packed away. If the Mount Rushmore speech was about more than monuments and more than one Independence Day celebration, then what was its lasting political message? The answer depends on separating confirmed facts from interpretation. The confirmed facts are straightforward. President Trump chose Mount Rushmore as the setting. He delivered the speech on the eve of Independence Day in 2020. He argued that America's history and cultural heritage were under attack, criticized efforts to remove monuments, and framed the moment as part of a broader struggle over the nation's identity. Those are matters of public record. What comes next is analysis. One reasonable interpretation is that the speech represented an attempt to redefine the political conversation during one of the most turbulent periods in recent American history. Remember the context. Public discussion at the time was dominated by the pandemic, economic uncertainty, and nationwide protests. Those issues involved public health, policing, and government policy. But Trump's speech shifted attention toward a different kind of question altogether. Instead of asking, what should government do next? It encouraged people to ask, what kind of country are we becoming? That is a fundamentally different conversation. Policy debates tend to focus on solutions. Identity debates focus on values. And values are often much harder to resolve because they are tied to people's understanding of history, culture, and belonging. This isn't a uniquely American phenomenon. Around the world, political leaders frequently appeal to national history during periods of uncertainty. Whether in Europe, Asia, Latin America, or elsewhere, references to founding moments, national heroes, and shared traditions often become more prominent when societies feel divided. Historians have long observed that collective memory can serve as a source of stability during times of rapid change. At the same time, that same memory can become a source of disagreement when different groups emphasize different parts of the past. That broader pattern helps explain why the Mount Rushmore speech continues to be discussed years later, not because everyone agrees about it, but because it touched a question that has no simple answer. How should a democracy remember its own history? Should national symbols primarily celebrate achievement? Should they also confront injustice? Can they do both at the same time? Those questions existed before 2020. They still exist today, and they are unlikely to disappear anytime soon. Here's where the story changes one final time. Over the years, public debate about the speech has often focused on whether it was divisive or patriotic. But those two labels, by themselves, don't explain very much. Political speeches rarely have a single audience. They speak simultaneously to supporters, critics, undecided voters, historians, journalists, and future generations who may revisit the moment with entirely different perspectives. Each audience hears something different because each brings different experiences into the conversation. A supporter may hear a defense of national pride. A critic may hear an incomplete account of American history. A historian may see another chapter in the long tradition of presidents using symbolic places to shape public memory. None of those observations erase the others. They simply reflect the reality that political communication operates on multiple levels at once. That's why context matters so much. Without understanding the historical moment, the location, and the national debate surrounding the speech, it's easy to reduce it to a handful of headlines or short video clips. But documentary analysis asks a different question. Not merely, what happened? Instead, why did it happen this way? And once you ask that question, the details begin connecting. The location, the timing, the national mood, the choice of themes, the historical symbolism, none of these elements existed in isolation. Together, they formed a carefully constructed political message, regardless of whether viewers ultimately accepted or rejected it. That doesn't mean every aspect was planned with perfect precision. Political events often take on meanings beyond what their organizers intended. Audiences interpret symbols in ways that no speechwriter can fully control. Once a speech enters the public conversation, its significance is shaped not only by the speaker, but also by the millions of people who watch, discuss, criticize, and remember it. In that sense, the Mount Rushmore address became part of something much larger than a single presidency. It became part of America's ongoing conversation about itself. A conversation that stretches back to the founding of the Republic, a conversation renewed after the Civil War, revisited during the Civil Rights Movement, and revisited again whenever the country faces moments of profound social change. History has a way of returning to the same questions, even if the names, the events, and the generations change. Perhaps that's why the image of a president speaking beneath four monumental faces remains so powerful. It reminds us that every generation inherits a story it did not begin. But every generation also decides how that story will be understood. Some choose to emphasize triumph. Others emphasize unfinished promises. Most try, in different ways, to hold both ideas together. Whether they succeed is something history usually decides much later. So was there a hidden political message in Trump's Mount Rushmore speech? If hidden means a secret message known only to a few people, probably not. The themes were stated openly. The symbolism was visible to anyone willing to look closely. The more interesting question is whether that symbolism was fully appreciated in the moment. Because beneath the immediate political arguments was a broader attempt to frame the national conversation around memory, identity, and the meaning of American history. Whether that framing was persuasive is for each viewer to decide. But the speech demonstrates something that extends far beyond one president or one election. In politics, the most influential messages are often not the ones that tell people what to think. They are the ones that quietly shape the question everyone starts asking. And perhaps that's the enduring lesson of that evening at Mount Rushmore. The monument remained exactly as it had been before the speech began. The stone did not change. The faces did not change. What continued to change, and what always changes in a democracy, was the conversation taking place beneath them.